Mr. Matt Mason, you have thought creative writing. Any human is born creative, or creativity can be learned?
It's really a mix of both. Anyone can write a good poem, and I think that by working on it harder, you can learn how to do it better. So I think everybody starts with a certain amount of creativity, but there's a lot that you can learn that can make you better, that can make you write something more effective. I certainly think there are some lucky who are born more creative than others and more able to start off it, but I think anyone can write a good poem.
Can we learn poetry no matter our age?
Definitely. There's a number of great poets didn't start until later in life, and I think it's something you can learn at any age.
Is slam poetry appreciated today? And if so, why?
Slam poetry is very well appreciated right now, which I think is fantastic. Slam poetry is just poetry, and it's really about the style more than the writing. So by doing poems in a poetry slam format, you get more energy, kind of more life to it, so it's more audience friendly. It's exciting, it's interesting, it's funny, and poetry isn't always seen as exciting, interesting, and funny. So I love that slam poetry is doing this, and it's spreading around the world. It's very popular in the United States, in Canada, in Germany, and all over the place, and it keeps spreading, so which makes me happy. There's good things about the slam format, and there's bad things, because you'll see poets who do wonderful, crazy performance, and the writing is just okay. But even so, it brings people out who are interested in poetry, and so I love it.
Slam poetry is about social, about network, about active life.
Yeah, a good poetry slam will be about all kinds of things. There will be a social message, there will be comic message. It's a good mix of different things going on in the world today. And so it's poetry that an audience can appreciate because that's who it's aimed at. It's not the poet reading for themselves. It's the poet really finding a way to read for the audience and find what they want to talk about and listen to.
Can be today the poetry an interactive act of creation?
Yes, some forms of poetry slam where it's a group of people putting on a poem together. And so I love that, especially in the United States. I work with a lot of student groups, and they all write their own poems, but they also get together and write poems for 2, 3, 4 people. So they write them together and they find a way to deliver them together. And it's almost like dance. It's choreographed with this voice, that voice, and movement, and it's a lot of fun to watch.
And also it's very difficult to create.
It is. There are different challenges with any kind of poem, but especially if you've got 2, 3, 4 people working together, trying to figure out what's best, what's the best way. It makes them work as a team and figure out the right way to do it. So it's fun. It's a lot of fun. I've done a lot of this.
Mr. Matt Mason, why did you prefer this genre, slam poetry?
I love the poetry slam because it makes poetry interesting and it makes poetry more relevant. I've been writing poetry for a long time, and when I first saw a poetry slam, realized that, any kind of poem you can use in a poetry slam, but it's the delivery that makes it slam poetry, and it's just the kind of thing that makes the audience part of the show. And I think that's important, because in the United States and in a lot of other countries, poetry was seen as boring, as a chore.
Also in Romania.
Oh, yeah, okay. And what slam poetry does is it turns it around. A poetry slam makes poetry into entertainment. And I think, there's good and bad. There's great poems that will never be in a poetry slam, probably, and there's a lot of poems in a poetry slam that are just not that well written, but you can make them engaging for an audience. And I think what the poetry slam does it gets people interested in poetry. It makes them see poetry in a different way, and maybe they'll start writing it, maybe they'll start reading it. Many of the students I work with, they start in the poetry slam, end up, reading Pablo Neruda and Adrian Rich and other great poets in a new way. It basically just is a way to teach people that poetry is a lot more fun than they think it is.
A very interesting perspective. Your message to kids is make poetry your own and trust yourself, you can do it. There is poetry on a tablet or on a social network.
Definitely. I think there's a lot that I've seen just with poets who share their work electronically, who on Facebook there are all kinds of discussions about different poems, different poetry readings, and things like that. I think it can definitely add to it because it makes collaboration easier.
And fun.
And I think it is important that the quote you used before about how I teach poetry, it's kind of, in school we're taught poetry a certain way. And what I try to teach students is whether you like how it's taught or not, write poems that you wish poetry was. So if you don't like poetry, what do you wish it was? Write that kind of poem. Don't write a poem that you think you're supposed to write. If you don't find the rules of poetry interesting, make up your own rules and see what happens. That's how I've been doing it. And sometimes I didn't know if what I was writing was poetry because I was writing things that were funny and weird. They had punchlines, like a joke. The books of poetry I was reading were not funny. After a while, you wonder, am I writing poetry? But then you read enough poems, you find other poets who are very well established, who are writing funny poems. You just have to look for them more. Maybe it's not what you read in school, but outside of school you'll find books that have poems that you'll like, because poetry is just as diverse as music. There's not one kind of music. It's not just classical and nothing else. And same with poetry. It's not just the classic poems. It's hip-hop, rap poems, country music poems, rock and roll poems. It's all these different kinds.
There still exists also classical music, like classical poems. Can we make and can we understand slam poetry after we read classical poetry?
Definitely. I think there's a lot of... What I love is when some places that have a poetry slam every week or every month, sometimes they'll have what's called either a cover slam or a dead poets slam, where they'll use classic poetry in a poetry slam format. So they'll read this other poet's poem, giving credit to, I'm now going to read a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, and then read the poem, bring life to it with the delivery, have the judges in the audience score it. And I think that's a good way to do it. I think it shows that any poem can be used in a poetry slam. The classic poems, the modern poems, it's just in how you present it.
Let's speak about your visit in Romania. In the Romanian public space, there are many debates today regarding reading and writing poetry. That is because many textbooks are not up to date with young people's activities. And also, the young people are not educated in such way. Is there a danger that the poetry may disappear from tomorrow's youth preoccupations?
Every few years, someone declares that poetry is dead, and yet it never goes away.
Like theater?
Yes. I think poetry is part of culture, like painting, like theater, like music. It's something that can go down in popularity, but it never disappears. It's always going to be there because it's part of what we do as humans. We need to express ourselves. We need to find the right way to make it lyrical, make an emotional statement. So I'm not worried about poetry going away, but definitely it could be taught better. But this is something that, if it's true in Romania, it's also true in the United States. It's true in Botswana, in Nepal, in Belarus. Everywhere I've been is kind of the same. Students don't find poetry interesting. When I was in high school, I didn't like poetry because the books I read all had poets who had been dead for at least 50 years, most of them much more. Doesn't make those poems bad, but it's harder to relate sometimes to these older poems. I want to read some poems that are more in the voice of today. You know, in some schools you can find some poems. If not in the textbook, maybe you can find them, on the internet or on YouTube even, with someone delivering their poems. And there are great resources. There's a YouTube channel in English called Button Poetry, which has modern poets reading their poems in kind of poetry slam style, but a little bit of performance to these really good poems. And I think the more that we get of teachers who are able to find these poems, the more it helps the students. I think we do need something that's about modern times. I mean, it's all modern issues: love, death, war, loneliness, happiness. It's all in poems from all ages, but we still kind of want someone speaking in today's voice to make it make more sense, make it more accessible. I'm glad that there are more resources with the internet, but it still takes a little extra work by a good teacher to make poetry come alive for students.
What are your impressions about Romanian students? They understand slam poetry, they love poetry?
Yeah, my impressions of Romanian students so far is fantastic. In Craiova, in Drobeta, the students I've worked with are very talented, because in both groups, I ask, how many of you have never written a poem except maybe if a teacher assigned it? Half the students raise their hands. And so these are students who are fresh into poetry. I've been working with them for only 2 days, and at the end of the 2 days, they are doing some amazing things with language. And not just doing amazing things with language, doing things with a language that's not their first language, which just kills me because I'm terrible at other languages, so I'm jealous. But every one of these students I've worked with, I think, are at the end better as writers than I was when I was in high school. There are many of them doing very sophisticated work with simile and metaphor, and just very creative work with the language they use. I'm very impressed.
At this age, what they prefer to write about love, about social activities, about politics?
It's been a little bit of everything. A lot of love, that's the main one, but I've kind of been using writing prompts that kind of start with a little bit about love. So a little bit about politics, just a little bit about everyday life, a little bit about school, a little bit about food. The same things you run across every day are the things that you can write poems about, and that's what they're doing.
Mr. Matt Mason, you have 2 daughters?
Yes.
They read or write poetry?
Not as much anymore. They read a lot. They do read a lot, and they like poetry that's kind of for kids. My oldest daughter, though, when she was younger, she used to go... My wife is a poet also. Yes. And so our oldest daughter would come with us to all these poetry readings and poetry slams. And so she started... She hasn't done it for a few years, but she would kind of get excited and has like, let's do a poetry reading. And then she would just improvise this crazy poem that was so much fun to watch, and then give a little thing she used as a microphone to me and to Sarah, my wife, and have us do poetry readings with her too. So it's been fun.
Did you make poetry on your NGO?
Yes.
Because you have an educational NGO.
Yes, it's called Nebraska Writers Collective, and it is all about bringing poetry into schools. Like we were talking about, it's about helping teachers teach poetry in a way that makes it more interesting, and helping students, and also helping local poets by paying them to go into schools. Because there aren't a lot of paying jobs for poets, and if we want to keep poets in our communities, we have to find ways to pay them for their work. But yeah, we've been teaching slam poetry to high school kids
in Nebraska
and Iowa, both states in the middle of the U.S. So these students learn poetry, they learn poetry slam, and they compete against other schools the same way you would with basketball or football, but with poetry.
And the results? are positive?
Oh my gosh. The results are amazing because we work with these students for several months. So they learn to write, they learn to appreciate poetry, but they really learn to say what's important to them in a way that is engaging. They're learning to communicate, they're learning self-confidence, they're learning how to work with others, how to give feedback, how to receive feedback. It's been amazing.
They are more open to the relationships with their parents, their educators.
I think so. I think because by learning how to say what's important to you, by getting self-confidence, you can communicate better with your parents, with your teachers, with anybody around you. So it's been powerful to watch. I know what poetry's done for me. It's made me a better person, and it's amazing to see that in the hundreds of students we work with.
Mr. Matt Mason, was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure
to find many novelties about poetry and slam poetry. And I hope you will enjoy your staying in Bucharest.